We have with us Shri Rajiv Malhotra, whose book, which was written recently and which was released yesterday, Being Different. Rajiv will be talking to us about that book, and we also have a number of other distinguished persons from academics who will be taking up various issues. I first met Rajiv. He shared some of his the work that he was doing, and as you may have read, Rajiv he is actually from our own Delhi University, from St. Stephen's College. I believe he did his physics honors a long time back, and then went to the US for further studies related to computers, and then established his own business and was an extremely successful business person. And but there was another side of his personality, and he has a strong spiritual leaning. In one of his encounters, I believe, with his guru, his guru had shared, kind of communicated to him that spirituality which only helps the individual but does not help the world is perhaps not true spirituality. Is just not coming up anywhere. And another thing he noticed was that a large number of people who were responsible for this negative portrayal of India in the academia in the US were non-resident Indians. Many of them trained initially in India and then in the US, and they were distinguished professors in various universities, in some of the very big universities. And then yet another thing that he had noticed was that in academics, in different disciplines, philosophy, even psychology, other social sciences, there was, he noticed that a large number of people had been influenced by Indian thought. And maybe early in their work they had acknowledged the influence of Indian thought, but later on that had totally been omitted. So these were some of the main concerns, and he wanted to attend to these issues. And then he established a foundation called the Infinity Foundation with his own money, and then large number of activities have been going on for the last 15 plus years related to these different issues, whether it is publication of books related to contribution of Indian thought, the efficacy of Indian thought, Indian systems. It's not just in terms of ideas, also in terms of the applications. And I think in the context of this book, he also realized that many of the leading countries, whether it's the Western countries, the US in particular, some of the European countries, they take a lot of pride in their culture. And they seem to be very clear about what their country, what their civilization, what their culture stands for. In stark contrast to that, we as a people, Indians, are rather confused about what it means to be an Indian, what does being Indian stand for. And so he started taking up that issue, and even people who are supposedly representing, let's say, the spiritual lineage, they seem to be ignorant about the larger issues, political issues around identity and religion. But the fact that he's been working on this book, this is the first solo authored book, it's clear that he felt that, well, this is not happening the way I see things, what is important, the issues which have to be highlighted. Last many years he's put together these ideas. He mentions it's 18 years of sadhana which have led to this work. We have Professor Girishwar Mishra who will be chairing the session. Professor Girishwar Mishra is known to most of you. He is a professor in this department. He's one of the leading psychologists in the country, and he has an international name.
It's a privilege to welcome Rajiv ji here. In his earlier visit, he raised some interesting questions. Questions about how Indian concepts are taken, revised and presented in a different way. And he illustrated with some interesting examples. This time he is with us in a different way, talking about being different. It's very interesting to see that India has been asked to view herself in terms, or through categories given by others. Who is Indian? What is the meaning of being Indian is defined not by Indians, by others. Those categories have been internalized by many of us because the kind of a scholarship which has grown is predominantly Euro-American in its orientation. Interestingly, the ideas which they propose in such a way that they appear as universal. If you go into details, you will see the impact of their culture, their thoughts. Perhaps psychology is the best example of Americanization of social science. It's not my observation, it's an observation by a person, an American, who has looked at the history of social sciences. So we use those categories and we follow those discourses, and India's self-understanding is informed by the kind of proposals, the kind of interpretations which are supplied by others. And there are many kinds of generalizations which are done at cultural level. Many kinds of characterizations which are done in terms of understanding Indian people. Many kinds of prescriptions have been given by others to provide inputs for economic development of India. Those who are from psychology, they are familiar with the work of Macmillan. The kind of achievement motive which was proposed by them based on Protestant ethic has been the model for trading. Gradually it has been realized that these models have certain limitations and we need to perhaps rediscover India. I am happy that many of these concerns have been critically analyzed by Rajiv ji in the book, Being Different. He looks at, based on documented evidence and kinds of interpretations that have been done, that how self-understanding from Indian perspective goes beyond the Euro-American scholarship and opens debates, provides inputs for a different worldview. One of the key words which he uses in this book is the dharmic worldview or dharma-centric perspective. Not the religious, but dharma. And he looks at what are the possibilities, What is the potential of this view? He also looks at how a new mode of dialogue can be initiated, not in terms of subjugating one, but by mutual respect, by developing a kind of synergy where there is respect for difference. So, he is going to offer some insights about the way we need to look at India, Indian thought, and he is going to perhaps offer a contour, a context in which better human relationships at national levels can be developed. It's the right time to have such academic intervention. I think cultural identities are becoming very, very important these days at national as well as international level. The issues which emerge in dealing with cultural diversity require our immediate attention. I hope that the ideas which Rajiv ji is going to present will provoke you, they will engage you critically in a very productive way. So I extend welcome to him. I also extend welcome to all of you. Rajiv ji.
Thank you for inviting me, and thank you for a wonderful audience being here. I was here in 2005, and in a moment I'll tell you in a nutshell the thesis which Professor Mishra also talked about, and how this book is an outcome of that talk, which may be surprising Sunit and Vishwarji. Some questions were raised, and then the same questions were raised many times. And in attempting to answer those questions came a whole new book. But before I do that, I just want to know how many of the students can, by raising their hand, how many of you are in psychology? I just want to know. Wonderful. So more or less all of you. So the subject of my talk last time was that I've been doing for about 15 years research on many things in cognitive science, psychology, neuroscience, mind sciences you might say, that are in the West, were actually learned and appropriated from Indian thought by people who then became pioneers in the West and started erasing the Indian sources to claim originality. Some of these examples happened during the life of the person, but some of them were very honest, like Jung, and he did not try to hide the sources. But after he died, his biographers downplayed the Indian sources. But during Jung's lifetime in 1930s, he used to teach in Zurich, summer institutes, which have been, his collected works are several volumes. And he used to teach Kundalini Yoga, and he used to teach about Patanjali, he used to teach about ideas of Tantra. And he used those words. And he was deeply informed about this, about theoretically. Of course, he was wrong on his prediction and advice about yoga for Westerners. He said it's a dangerous thing to practice above the fifth, sixth chakra, because the claim of the yogi of transcendence and unity consciousness is some kind of malady. It's not a normal thing. And for Westerners to try that would be a dangerous state of mind. So this is a very well-established quote, which of course is wrong because now a lot of Westerners are doing yoga. And I always point this out to some of them. So Jung is an example, and now we have transpersonal psychology. The whole discipline of transpersonal psychology started with a lot of Americans coming to India and having this guru or that guru, learning, spending time in Rishikesh, learning various techniques. Some of them would get initiated, change their names, and then they would go back and start their own yoga center, start their own meditation, and to teach Americans in a language that the Americans would understand. They would disguise or hide or delete the Indian references, and soon some of them would become very famous. And then some of them would go even further and start denigrating, not just omitting the Indian sources, but actually denigrating as inferior to kind of claim that they have something superior to bring. So I call this the U-turn theory. I call it the U-turn because the person starts with the West and comes back to the West, but goes through the Indian journey. And my last talk was on the U-turn theory, and I gave you many examples of U-turn, several dozen examples of U-turn. And I've been working on a book on the U-turn theory for the last 15 years. And now there's U-turn of Sri Aurobindo's teachings into Ken Wilber, which is bothering me, and I'm writing a book on that. So, the question that somebody asked here was, why did U-turn? After all, why couldn't the person be comfortable having Indianized enough to get the benefit to just remain there? So what was there about his own Western identity which was incompatible with the Indianness that he found useful? So they created a split personality or a schism in his head. On the one side, he is the reason he does that. And I started using the term the U-turn moment to describe that cognitive state when the person changes his identity or his affiliation or his relationship with Indian spiritual traditions and cause him to bounce back into a U-turn back into his original identity. And when he U-turns back, he doesn't return the same person that left. He took off from one place and he comes back reformed, modified, enhanced, a different kind of Westerner than he used to be. But still something happened that caused him to bounce back. What was it that caused him to bounce back? Now this question kept coming up in every talk on U-turn theory. I've probably given 100 talks on U-turn theory, and that's the next book will come out next year. When I was here, Professor Mishra said, when is this happening? So it's taken me longer than I promised, but it is coming out next year. Now in this U-turn book, I had to put a chapter saying the U-turn moment and what is irreconcilable difference. That's the origin of this. What are the irreconcilable differences where the Westerner not uprooted his original conditioning as a Westerner, has brought in so many Indian things, but now there's a conflict which he can't resolve. So either he has to give up his Western identity and just stay here and become an Indian, a lot of them have done that, or he has to disown this and go back and become a Westerner and appropriate selectively whatever will fit the Western identity and give up the West. What are these differences? So I started writing, I came up with one idea and I wrote a chapter, then I added a little more, and then I added a little more. And when this U-turn theory book went for peer reviews, people said that this U-turn theory is a wonderful piece of work in social psychology of Americans having an Indian experience and what are all the outcomes and flow chart of different possibilities and so on. But this business of what are the irreconcilable differences is heavy, too heavy in its philosophy, philosophical differences, philosophical irreducible, irreconcilable differences. So someone said, why don't you take that out and your U-turn book will be easier. And after thinking, I took it out. So now the question was, what do I do with this piece that I've taken out, which used to be 100 pages? And I figured that this might make a little book by itself on what are the irreconcilable differences. which caused the U-turn in the first place. And what started as a 100-page little monograph, the more I delved into it, the more debates I did research on Westerners who had done the U-turn. I went to many Westerners who had dual identity, many Westerners who were in denial that they were doing U-turns, many Westerners who rationalized the U-turn as a logical thing to do because they said that the future of Indian thought lies with Westerners because their framework can assimilate it and make it more useful than Indians could make it. So it's sort of like justifying, I'm taking your assets because they are more useful, better protected with me than with you, that kind of thing. So after a whole lot of these discussions, this 100-page monograph on what are the serious differences that cannot be reconciled kept growing. And each time I would send it around for another round of critique. I would have to churn more ideas and make it more, arguments more solid. This now, I decided should be the first volume as a pre-volume for my U-turn theory. So this book is a pre-volume for the U-turn theory. In the U-turn theory, I will not have to re-explain why the differences are not easy to solve psychologically from the Westerner's point of view. What horrifies him, what bothers him about the Indianness that he has to U-turn back. And this book the goal is to serve that purpose. So that's one of the purposes. Now, challenging Western universalism is the subtitle, but I think the speakers before have already talked about it, so I will not repeat the importance of challenging this Western universalism, except to point out that Chinese are already challenging Western universalism using Confucian thought as an alternative form of universalism. There is a Professor Tu Wemming at Harvard, whom I have interacted with, and he's constructed this thesis of Chinese Confucian thought offering a whole approach to modernity, to science, to human rights, all kinds of things. And he says that China's future as a modern nation is not copying West, but being itself. And whereas Indians unfortunately think that being ourselves will mean going back to the past, and we can't have iPods and iPads and technology and modern medicine. And so if we want the benefits of modernity, we have to disconnect from the past. The Chinese are saying it's not a choice either or. We are going to be the best in the modernity sense, but we are not going to lose track of our sense of who we are as Confucian people. So we are going to merge Confucianism with modernity our own way. And that's an alternative universalism the Chinese have put out. And then there is another, then you could say there's an Islamic universalism, which has not come to terms with modernity, but it's a worldview which can be said to be applicable from their point of view. It is available to the whole world, and it addresses many social and different kinds of issues. So there's at least three contending universalisms. There is the Western, there is the Chinese, there is the Islamic. And I've been giving talks for a number of years on is there an Indian contribution to universalism? Is there an Indian kind of universalism that it has to offer? This process that I have gone through in our tradition is called Purva Paksha, which means you study the other. You study the other with mutual respect, and you understand the other, where the other is coming from, but try to put yourself in their shoes. Having lived in the United States for 40 years, and having had a hobby, and for the last 15 years, full-time, I don't have a job, business, I'm unemployed for 15 years. Research is all I do. So I've been doing the Purva Paksha Western people. Western scholars, Christian theologians, secular people, scientists, people of various kinds, whites, blacks. This is my Purva Paksha of the West for 40 years. And as a result of this, I've developed various ideas that are in this book, which show how the Westerner seems to be different from the Indian lens if you reverse the gaze and rather than Westerners looking at us and finding us peculiar, strange, exotic, interesting. If I reverse the gaze and looked at it from an Indian lens at the Westerner, in what way would they seem different? And these differences then become my theory of why they U-turn. It is because of these differences which they are not able to sort out. Yeah? So this is kind of a general overview of what the project is about. I've introduced a number of terms in this book. One of them is the idea of a civilization getting digested into another civilization. By digestion, I mean that, like a tiger eats the deer, meaning that the deer no longer exists, and the tiger becomes a stronger tiger, because the two DNAs are incompatible. You cannot have the merger with both DNAs coexisting. So since the tiger is the stronger one that predominates, the deer is broken into very small parts, smaller molecules, smaller and smaller, and there's no more deer DNA left. There's not one cell of deer DNA left in the tiger's body because it would be incompatible. And that loss of the deerhood is the food for the tiger, and the tiger becomes a strong tiger. And I give this example to those who say, well, why are you concerned if we get digested into the West? It will be good, everybody will do yoga, everybody will do all our things. And I'm saying yes, but there will be no more Indianness as such. You will become part of the West, perhaps as a second tier, second class satellite. And there are plenty of examples of civilizations that got digested into the West. The pagan civilizations, the Native Americans, the African civilizations contributed immensely. There are so many things you could talk about which they contributed to Western civilization. And yet, while things were picked out here and there and eaten and assimilated and turned into Western theory, Western thought, Western assets, the Native Americans themselves perished and they live in museums. So you can have a civilization which is depleted and drained of its assets because these have been appropriated, and the civilization itself is just a history that some scholars know about and it lives in the museum. So the idea of being digested is an issue, and one of the projects of this book is to identify what is so different about Indianness that it will resist digestion. It will give indigestion. It will give indigestion to the party that is trying to eat it and consume it, unless that party distorts it. So if the West takes yoga and says, I will do yoga and I will not distort it, I will not stop at the sixth chakra like Jung said. I will not, because that's a distortion. I will let it go all the way. What exactly will happen to them which scares them? That tells me that this is, if I were to protect that, which they don't want, if I were to insist that this is a package deep, you can't distort it, then I have created a term I use called poison pill, which means you can digest me, but you get indigestion out of it. Yeah? And so several agendas are being served in this project. First, why Westerners U-turn? Because they find something they cannot deal with while remaining Western. Second, in what way do they, in order to digest, distort or limit or cut off? What do they cut off from the Indian civilization to make it digestible without harming themselves? And third, if I were to leave those things in the tradition and say, okay, have it, but have the whole thing, what is the nature of the harm it will do to the Western identity? So this is the kind of difference I'm looking for. I'm not looking for difference that is casual, pop culture, the Westerners wear bindi and they can light a lamp on Diwali and they can do bhangra. I'm not talking about those kind of differences because that's very casual, pop culture, pastry culture. I'm talking about very serious metaphysical issues. So I have in this book identified 4 differences of this kind, where the difference is such that the West, if it accepts the Indian idea or Indian principle, will self-destruct, or it will be damaging, or it will be very painful. So they would rather delete that part. And the nature of Indians is such that that part is not deletable without compromising us. So it's a tough situation. Therefore, the book is controversial, because I'm not saying happy ending, everybody Bollywood happy ending. I'm raising an issue and I'm wanting people to think about it, even though it's troubling. So the first difference, which is in chapter 2. Chapter 1 is sort of the whole philosophy of difference, which I just mentioned. But chapter 2 comes to the heart of it. It's the difference I discovered in the United States. And a whole contingent of Americans invited by the Templeton Foundation at an event in 2003 in Bangalore, which we co-sponsored. And I gave a talk, and the reaction of that, and then dozens of talks I gave to keep fine-tuning this issue, confirmed how serious this difference is. And this difference is what I call history centrism. History centrism is a Judeo-Christian notion that the ultimate truth can only be known through historical prophets. It has to do with the nature of man being limited, and there is no capacity for the man to reach a state of consciousness where every man can find out, even though it may be difficult to achieve, but in theory, every person can find out a truth, like a rishi claims or an enlightened master claims. Because the reason these two are opposite and incompatible is that the history centrism is a linear, and the word linear you have to underline, it's a linear sequence of events which happen uniquely. It is of an absolute status. In other words, there is no such ever event happening anywhere else, nor it happened before, nor it happened again. And for it to be true, you must falsify all alternative claims. So you cannot have multiple accounts of history. You cannot say that in this village they had God visit them, said this, and in that village they said this. You have to deny all of those as false in order for this history-centric account to be a valid account. So I found this to be so central in the thinking, and I'm talking about Americans. Okay, different Europe. I haven't done my research in Europeans. Europeans should not be considered the same as Americans, because Americans are quite different in this regard. Now, there are counter movements in the West. A lot of liberal theologians who are Vedantic in nature and who are accepting the nature of man as Satchitanand, capable of unity consciousness, all these Vedantic ideas and Sri Aurobindo ideas, you will find Westerners who also bring. But they are on the margins in terms of the established order is concerned. The established order, the best proof is a phrase that you should look up to understand what is the core DNA of Judeo-Christianity or Christianity per se. And that phrase is the Nicene Creed. The Nicene Creed was developed in the 4th century in a town called Nicaea, which is now in Turkey. I just visited that a couple of years ago. And this creed established the mandate of what the minimum beliefs are in order to be a Christian. And the minimum beliefs required original sin, redemption, virgin birth, crucifixion, whatever. So this mandatory belief as an exclusive set of historical events without which you are not qualified to join a particular denomination is incompatible with the yogic belief, the Sri Aurobindo belief, the Shaivite belief of transcendence, where without recourse to history, you can know the thing yourself. So either I'm dependent on history, or I'm able to go inside and find and achieve it for myself. These are the two systems. If I'm dependent on history, then there is an institution which knows the history because I was not there. History happened so long ago. So an institution claims the authority to interpret that history and teach it and spread it and enforce it. So the historicity of prophetic lineage becomes like the source code. So Microsoft's biggest asset is the source code of Windows. And they cannot compromise that because there is nothing left. So this source code of a dogma of history becomes the asset of the institution, and that becomes your sole path to salvation, otherwise you cannot. Now if the yogic claim is accepted, which by the way many Christian mystics also made. There have been many Christian mystics in history. It's not that mystics only happened in India. But the authority of the church was so powerful to suppress them all the time. In the contest, whenever the mystic contests, he's persecuted, finished off. Whereas here, when a mystic comes and says, I've had this experience, he's considered and he's considered a very exalted guy, and everybody goes and follows him. Whereas there, he's persecuted. So it's not that Indians, because of their genetics, are the only ones who have mystical experiences, but somehow the claims of the rishis and the claims of the yogis, which are not history-centric. You do not need to know the historicity of Patanjali to get the benefits of yoga. You do not need to know the historicity of a particular rishi in order that the mantra he talks about works on you. Its effect is independent. It's sort of like Newtonian law of gravitation is not dependent on Newton's history. So if somebody says, I don't believe Newton existed, or I don't believe he existed here, he existed somewhere else, and his life story is wrong, physicists are not going to go up in arms and start screaming and saying the sky will fall, the building will fall, gravity will not work, we will all be, because it all depends on, it is not the laws are not contingent on an event in history, the laws existed before always. This is what we mean by Sanatana. This is what we mean by beginningless. This is what we mean by Shrutis being apurishaya, means authorless. So gravitation is all of these things. Gravitation is apurishaya, no author like Newton created it. So science is ahistorical. There is a history of scientific discovery. That just means that somebody discovered it, but he did not stop it. Yeah. So whereas the history centrism in Judeo-Christian says that God comes and issues a new release, like you have Windows, then Windows 3, Windows 5, Windows 7, like that. So God gives a new release called covenants. That's a historical event. And at that moment in time, new laws begin. And that is how the cosmos is going to be working from now on. And everybody should migrate to the latest release. So God's releases are the operating system of the universe. So this is a very history-centric kind of mindset. Now, if the yoga is to be accepted without distortion, it will finish off the history centrism. Because the yoga view will be that history centrism is what we call nam roop. You are stuck with this mithya. You are stuck with this sense of identity, that self and ego you have to transcend. The sense that I belong to this race and I belong to this chosen tribe, or I come from this, is all limiting you, and the yoga it says that you have to get beyond it. So this is a very big threat to the institutional power. So the history-centric institutions cannot tolerate the ultimate that the yoga takes you to. They will accept it up to a point. That's why his project was to take a whole lot of yogic thought and argue a new interpretation of the Bible. He argued with bishops, they did not accept his interpretation. But he took the whole lot of yogic thought to reconstitute an interpretation of Christianity. But certain things would not fit, so he had to throw them out. That was his U-turn limit. So I differentiate the history centrism of a civilization, which leads to absolute ideas of history, with another civilization's what I call embodied knowing, means in my body, living here and now, nothing to do with what happened to somebody else somewhere, but my own experiences which I can create through certain practices. That is my path to truth. That gives me a higher experience. I am not here to say that one system is superior to the other, but simply to tell you that they're different. I'm not here to say that the yogi's experience is the correct one and is valid. I'm merely here to tell you that the two are incompatible, that the ultimate where yoga takes you will have no room for a history-centric approach. That's all I'm here to tell you. So therefore, this is one example. I have 4 in the book, but I won't have time to go through all of them. This is one example of an irreconcilable difference which causes people to U-turn because they have, T.S. Eliot is one example of a U-turn. He studied Sanskrit in Harvard. He translated a lot of some of the most famous poems. Can I have a raise of hands of those who read T.S. Eliot? Anybody here read T.S. Eliot? Some people have. Okay. T.S. Eliot is considered by a lot of people as the leading American poet of the 20th century. And what is not known, because the biographers like to hide this, is that for several years he was studying Sanskrit at Harvard, and some of his greatest poems are actually literal translations from the Upanishads. An associate of mine in Princeton, whose name is Cleo Kearns, went and lived with T.S. Eliot's widow, who was alive at the time, for her PhD dissertation, and her dissertation is called T.S. Eliot and Indic Traditions. How the Indic traditions influenced his poetry, and in his widow showed unpublished, his diaries. He's got his copy of Gita and Upanishads, and in the margins he's translating, and those translated verses become his poems, which become world famous. And so the question is, what was the U-turn moment? Why didn't he just go on? In fact, he writes this himself. This is such a smoking gun for me, such an interesting discovery. T.S. Eliot explains. He writes somewhere, and I have it quoted in the place in the book I can show, in U-turn theory, this book that comes. T.S. Eliot says that this discovery of this knowledge, this Sanskrit literature and language and philosophy is so exalted that it makes all Greek and European thinkers look like schoolboys. That's his words. He's so impressed. Then he goes on to say that to really go further, I now have reached the point that I have to give up my sense of being an Englishman and an American and a Westerner. So he understands this irreconcilability, that he'll have to give up this identity that he's carrying, that we are the people with this civilization, American exceptionalism, manifest destiny, founding fathers, all these great pillars of history that Americans are taught, Westerners are taught about their past. I'll have to give that up because the journey that this is taking me into is of such a high state of consciousness and there's no room for any of this. And he struggles with this and has to make a choice, and makes the choice that I'll stay where I am and forego the further journey. But at least he's a very honest man. A very honest statement of his, which is a beautiful piece to quote. And then he's now a middle-aged guy. So then he does a public re-Christianing, re-baptism into Christianity to sort of clean out all the influence that the Sanskrit teaching might have brought him. So he kind of has to, it's almost like he has to purge this contamination that may have come into him. And that's T.S. Eliot's experience. So I will, I could go on. There are four, I'll tell you the other three very quickly, so then we can go on to the program. So the one I've explained in some detail is history centrism versus the tradition of yoga, meditation, here and now, state of consciousness available to everybody without recourse to history. Second is the concept of unity. The nature of unity is different in the two civilizations. In one, it is integral unity, and in the other, it is synthetic unity. I will not have too much time to explain what they are, but I'll tell you in a nutshell. Integral unity is where the unity is inherent. You don't have to bring things together. You don't have to force them into unity. You don't have to work hard to keep things together. Like my unity, this committee's unity is a synthetic unity. They are brought together, but they do have separate existence. United Nations is a synthetic unity. The G20 is a synthetic unity. A coalition party in India is a synthetic unity. Integral unity is where there is, the parts are either relative to the unity and do not exist as such anyway. The parts do not have a separate self-existence. They don't even exist. They exist only relative to the unity, so that unity can never be broken because it's the inherent nature. Now Buddhists call this mutual codependence and shunyata, and a very central Buddhist principle is non-essentialism, means there are no essences and there are no separate things that have a separateness, separate existence at all possible. And in the Hindu tradition, you call Brahman as a basic underlying integral unity. So, whereas in the Western tradition, both biblical and the Hellenistic or Greek thought, which merged to create the West, have a synthetic unity. In the biblical thought, God is infinitely removed from the cosmos and from souls, and one soul is always, even in heaven, different from the other soul. So if we all go to heaven, we will be separate individuals and having coffee together and having seminars, playing golf and things like that, but we're separate. In the Hellenistic tradition, Aristotle's thought superseding Plato's thought. Plato was more kind of like the Indian in some respect, but he didn't continue. It was superseded by Aristotle. Aristotelian thought is very much on separate existing entities that have to come together to make collective things. So an automobile is a synthetic unity because the tire exists, and the battery exists, and the paint exists, and then all these things are assembled. So then the unity between the Hellenistic tradition and the Hebraic tradition or Judeo-Christian tradition is another synthetic unity. So I go through 5 milestones, major milestones in Western history, where more and more things are synthesized, more and more things are from various places are put together. And now they're trying to put yoga into their way of thinking without the compromise that I mentioned earlier, which would be required. So I contrast synthetic unity and integral unity. Then the third one is attitude towards chaos or disorder or complexity or flux. And here again I point out, using a lot of references in my own research, the Indian comfort with things that are unexpected happening, which the Westerner would consider to be cognitive overload. The Westerner would say it's chaos, disorder, and the Indian is not that bothered by it. I'm not saying it's better or worse, but it's different. It has some advantages, it also has some disadvantages. And the fourth one, which is not reducible or you cannot get away with in terms of difference, is the non-translatability of certain sounds, certain vibrations, certain mantras, because it's not the conceptual meaning, it's their vibrational effect on you. And so the philosophy of Sanskrit, being what it is claims. I do not say it's a valid claim or a false claim, but it's a claim. And that claim is different than the Western claim about language. So I'm comparing claims versus claims. I'm not comparing one to be true versus the other to be false in any of these. It's different, like apple is different from orange. It's not that one is better than the other. So the claim of Sanskrit grammar is the non-translatability of the fundamental root sounds, because the vibrational effect it has is unique to that vibration, and another vibration will have a different effect. Whereas in the English language, the word is not a vibrational effect, but an arbitrary meaning assigned to it. There is an arbitrariness. We call this might. We could have called it anything, or like that. So these are 4 what I call non-bridgeable. You can't bridge these differences between the 2 civilizations. And there are several implications of identifying these. First, it helps me close my 15-year-old book project on U-turn theory, because now I can write the U-turn theory and say I've also explained why the U-turn. Second, what is different about us from the West is what we ought to make sure does not get digested. Because if this gets digested, then you are nothing left. You just become second class, quasi-Westerners in a satellite and sitting in a museum somewhere as some exotic old culture like many others have become. But preserving these distinctivenesses, asserting them, and the resistance that knowing these distinctivenesses can turn into a resistance to colonization. And the decolonization that has become a popular topic of study requires some ground you're standing on which you consider to be non-negotiable selfhood. And from that non-negotiable selfhood, you can then go about becoming self-conscious of how you've been colonized. And then you can go about reversing that and claiming. Now, final comment I'll make is that a lot of criticism comes in the form of, why are you talking about difference? Doesn't it create tension? Why aren't we all the same? Point is, first of all, if it's difference with mutual respect, it need not cause tension. If it's difference from a sense of superiority or exclusivity, like history-centrism. History-centrism is a difference. My history is different from yours. My history is valid, yours must be wrong. And I have several examples of that. Okay. But if my yogic experience is how I felt, this is what I tried, this is the result I got. Now you are telling me you tried something else and you felt something else. I don't know. I have no reason to doubt it. I cannot, and my validity of my experience does not depend on falsifying it. So this is the way, so you can have difference with mutual respect. The response is that if you claim everything is same, on whose terms? My terms or your terms?